The champagne glass slipped from my trembling fingers and shattered against the marble floor of the wedding venue. 300 guests turned to stare as I stood there in my hospital gown under a hastily thrown-on coat, for bruise still purple on my arm. But I wasn't looking at them. I was looking at my husband of 12 years exchanging vows with my former assistant, wearing my grandmother's wedding dress that I'd saved in our closet. The same husband who'd signed divorce papers while I was unconscious in surgery. The same husband who'd stolen my CEO position while I was fighting for my life. The same husband who had no idea that 3 hours ago, I'd regained control of everything he thought he'd taken from me. My name is Sarah Chin, and this is the story of how I died on an operating table and came back to life just in time to destroy the two people who buried me while I was gone. 6 months earlier, I was living what I thought was my perfect life. CEO of Meridian Technologies, a company I'd built from nothing into a $100 million enterprise. Married to David, my college sweetheart who'd supported my dreams when everyone else called me crazy for thinking a 22-year-old could revolutionize data security. We had our struggles, sure. The long hours. The missed dinners. The way success had created distance between us that we both pretended didn't exist. But I thought we were solid. I thought 12 years of marriage meant something. I was wrong about a lot of things. The first sign something was off came during our company's annual board meeting. I noticed David whispering with my assistant, Elena Rodriguez. Not unusual by itself, but there was something intimate about the way their heads bent together. Something that made my stomach clench even though I couldn't explain why. Elena had been with the company for 2 years. Brilliant, ambitious, beautiful in that effortless way that made other women feel suddenly aware of their own flaws. I'd hired her because she reminded me of myself at that age, hungry and determined to prove herself. I'd mentored her, trusted her with sensitive information, treated her like the little sister I'd never had. That was my first mistake. The headaches started 3 weeks later. Sharp, stabbing pains that would hit without warning and leave me gasping. I pushed through them because that's what I'd always done. Push through. Fight harder. Sleep was for people who didn't have empires to build. David barely noticed. He was traveling more for his consulting work, or so he said, coming home late with excuses that felt rehearsed. When I tried to talk to him about the headaches, about the way my vision would blur during meetings, he'd nod and make appropriate concerned noises while scrolling through his phone. The building held its breath the morning I collapsed in the boardroom. I was presenting our quarterly projections when the world tilted sideways. The last thing I remember was Elena's face hovering over mine, her lips moving but no sound reaching my ears. Then darkness swallowed everything. Brain aneurysm. The words hit like a physical blow when I woke up 3 days later, tubes snaking down my throat, machines beeping their mechanical lullabies around me. Dr. Martinez explained it with the gentle detachment doctors perfect over years of delivering devastating news. Emergency surgery had saved my life, but I'd need another procedure to fully repair the damage. More surgery meant more risk. More time unconscious. More time away from my company. David held my hand while the doctor spoke, but his fingers felt cold against my skin. When Dr. Martinez left, I tried to tell him how scared I was. How the thought of going under again terrified me more than dying had. But David was already checking his phone, already thinking about somewhere else he needed to be. I should have signed the power of attorney papers to Elena, not him. That was my second mistake, though I wouldn't understand the magnitude of it until much later. The night before my second surgery, Elena visited. She brought flowers and chocolate and sat beside my bed with a kind of focused attention I hadn't gotten from David in months. She listened as I rambled about my fears, about what would happen to Meridian if something went wrong. She promised me everything would be fine, that she'd watch over things while I recovered, that David was handling the business side perfectly. Her dark eyes never wavered from mine when she lied to my face. I went into surgery believing my husband and my protégé would protect everything I'd built. I went under thinking I was surrounded by people who loved me. The surgery took 14 hours. Complications, they said later. My brain had swelled beyond what they'd expected. They'd had to put me into a medically induced coma to give my body time to heal. For 6 weeks, I existed in a gray space between life and death, while the people I trusted most picked apart my life like vultures. I'll never know what those weeks felt like from the outside. Whether David sat by my bedside and held my hand. Whether he whispered promises he had no intention of keeping. Whether Elena brought more flowers and played the part of the devoted assistant grieving her mentor's condition. What I know is that while my brain slowly healed, they were busy destroying everything I'd ever worked for. The first thing I noticed when consciousness crept back wasn't the sound of machines or the antiseptic smell of the hospital. It was silence. No flowers on the bedside table. No cards from colleagues. No David sleeping in the uncomfortable chair he'd claimed he'd never leave. Just me and the quiet hum of medical equipment keeping track of a heartbeat that felt foreign in my chest. My throat was raw from the breathing tube they'd finally removed. When I tried to call for a nurse, only a scratchy whisper emerged. But it was enough. Within minutes, Dr. Martinez was explaining what had happened. 6 weeks. Brain swelling. Touch and go. Lucky to be alive. I asked about David. The pause before Dr. Martinez answered told me everything I needed to know. David hadn't been there when I woke up because David had stopped coming 2 weeks ago. The nurses had mentioned it to each other when they thought I couldn't hear, those first fuzzy days when I drifted in and out of awareness. How the husband had barely visited after the first week. How he'd seemed more interested in his phone calls than his wife's condition. But I didn't know the real truth yet. That would come later, delivered in pieces that cut deeper than any surgeon's blade. The first piece arrived with my phone. The nurse handed it to me with an apologetic smile, explaining that my husband had brought my things but hadn't wanted to wake me. Dozens of missed calls from board members, investors, department heads. Text messages that started concerned and grew increasingly frantic as weeks passed without response. But it was the email notification that stopped my breathing. Board meeting minutes from Meridian Technologies. Dated 3 days ago. Emergency session called to address CEO incapacitation and leadership transition. My hands shook as I opened the attachment. Corporate language trying to soften the blow of what they'd done. Temporary appointment of interim CEO David Chen, approved by unanimous board vote. Restructuring of executive positions to ensure continued operational efficiency. Immediate implementation of new management protocols. They'd voted me out. While I was unconscious, fighting for my life, my own board of directors had stripped me of everything I'd built. I scrolled through the meeting notes with growing horror. Elena Rodriguez promoted to Chief Operating Officer. David Chen granted full executive authority over all company decisions. Sarah Chen's return to active duty to be evaluated based on medical clearance and board approval. Medical clearance and board approval. They were treating me like an invalid who might never be competent enough to run her own company again. They were treating me like I was already dead. The phone slipped from my numb fingers and clattered to the floor. A nurse rushed in, concerned by the sound and the way I was hyperventilating. But how do you explain that you've just witnessed your own corporate funeral? How do you tell someone that the people closest to you have carved up your life like a Thanksgiving turkey? I spent the rest of that day staring at the ceiling, trying to process the betrayal. David I could almost understand. He'd always resented living in my shadow, had made comments over the years about how the company came before our marriage. Maybe he saw my illness as an opportunity to finally step out from behind the successful wife who made him feel small. But Elena I had trusted. Elena I had lifted up and guided and believed in. Elena who knew better than anyone how much Meridian meant to me, how every decision I made was driven by love for the company I'd built from nothing. The second piece of truth arrived with the divorce papers. A process server in a cheap suit, apologetic but determined to do his job. He explained that since I'd been incapacitated, the papers had been served through legal publication and were now considered properly delivered. I had 30 days from the date of service to respond. The date of service was 4 weeks ago. I'd been divorced for a month and hadn't even known it. The papers cited irreconcilable differences and David's need to protect his financial interests given my uncertain medical prognosis. He wasn't asking for alimony, but he was claiming half of everything we'd built together. Half of Meridian. Half of our house. Half of our savings. Half of a life I'd apparently forfeited the moment I went under anesthesia. My lawyer's business card was paper-clipped to the documents. Rebecca Hartman, someone I'd never heard of, which meant David had hired his own representation without telling me, without giving me a chance to choose my own counsel, or even understand what was happening. The betrayal burned like acid in my chest. 12 years of marriage dissolved with legal paperwork while I was unconscious. Not even the courtesy of a conversation. Not even the basic human decency of waiting until I could defend myself. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the addendum buried in the financial disclosures. David's claim that my medical condition had rendered me unfit to make business decisions, and that his assumption of CEO duties was necessary to protect shareholder interests and preserve company value. He was using my illness against me, making it sound like brain surgery had turned me into an incompetent child who needed to be managed by more stable adults. I called Rebecca Hartman's office from my hospital bed, expecting to speak to David's hired gun. Instead, I got a warm voice that caught me off guard with its compassion. Rebecca explained that she'd been trying to reach me for weeks, that she'd been hired by someone else entirely to protect my interests. Someone who'd known what David was planning before I did. My grandmother had set up a trust 20 years ago when I'd first started Meridian. Money she'd saved her entire life, invested in my dream when no bank would take a risk on a 22-year-old with an idea and no collateral. The trust had a provision that if I ever became incapacitated, Rebecca would be activated as my legal representative to protect my assets from any potential exploitation. My grandmother had died when I was 25, but she'd still been looking out for me from beyond the grave. Rebecca's voice was steady as she explained what David had done. How he'd used the power of attorney to push through board decisions while I was unconscious. How he'd claimed my illness was permanent and positioned himself as the only person capable of running Meridian. How he'd filed for divorce using my medical condition as justification for his need to protect himself financially. But Rebecca had been watching, documenting, building a case. The trust owned 49% of Meridian Technologies. David had somehow forgotten to mention that in his power grab. The other 51% was held in various smaller stakes by board members, investors, and employees. What David didn't realize was that the trust shares came with a clause that could trigger a complete ownership review if there was evidence of malfeasance or breach of fiduciary duty. Rebecca had evidence. Financial records showing David had diverted company funds to personal accounts. Email chains between David and Elena discussing their plans to restructure Meridian in ways that would benefit them personally. Communication with potential buyers who were interested in acquiring the company at a fraction of its actual value. They weren't just stealing my position. They were planning to sell my life's work for pennies on the dollar and split the profits. The third piece of truth arrived like a knife between my ribs. Rebecca showed me the photos on our third meeting when I was finally strong enough to handle the complete picture. David and Elena at restaurants, hotels, conferences where Meridian was supposedly sending only David as our representative. The timeline stretched back 8 months. Long before my aneurysm. Long before my surgery gave them the perfect excuse to take over. They'd been planning this for almost a year. Elena whispering in David's ear during board meetings wasn't new love. It was conspiracy. Every late night David claimed to be working was time spent plotting with my assistant to steal my company. Every concerned conversation Elena had with me about Meridian's future was intelligence gathering for their coup. My illness didn't create the betrayal. It just gave them the opportunity to execute a plan they'd been perfecting for months. I stared at photos of my husband and my protégé holding hands over dinner, sharing hotel rooms at industry conferences, laughing together while they destroyed my life piece by piece. And I felt something inside me turn to ice. The Sarah Chun who'd gone into surgery 6 weeks ago had died on that operating table. The woman who'd woken up was someone else entirely. Someone harder. Someone who understood that trust was a luxury she could no longer afford. Someone who was going to take back everything they'd stolen, no matter what it cost. Recovery became my obsession. physical therapy to regain my strength, cognitive exercises to prove my mind was sharp, legal strategy sessions with Rebecca to plan our counterattack. I pushed myself harder than any of my doctors recommended because I knew David and Elena were counting on me being weak, being broken, being too damaged to fight back. They were about to learn they'd made a terrible miscalculation. The hospital staff whispered about my determination, how I'd gone from barely able to walk to doing laps around the cardiac wing, how I demanded my laptop and was working again within days of regaining consciousness, how I'd transformed from a pitiful figure in a hospital gown to something focused and dangerous. David visited once during those final weeks. He brought flowers and sat beside my bed with a kind of forced concern that fooled exactly no one. He talked about how worried he'd been, how hard he'd been working to keep Meridian stable while I recovered, how the doctors had told him my condition was touch and go, and he'd had to make difficult decisions to protect our future. I let him talk. Let him paint himself as the devoted husband who'd sacrificed to save his wife's company. Let him spin his web of lies while I sat there with my hands folded, my face carefully neutral. He had no idea I knew about the divorce, about Elena, about the conspiracy they'd been hatching for months. He thought he was talking to the same trusting wife who'd signed power of attorney papers before surgery. That woman was gone. When David finished his performance, I squeezed his hand and thanked him, told him how grateful I was for everything he'd done, how lucky I felt to have someone who loved me enough to carry such a heavy burden. His smile was perfect, warm and relieved, and completely convinced he'd fooled me. The last piece of truth came from Elena herself. She arrived the day before I was scheduled for discharge, carrying a bouquet of lilies and wearing the kind of professional sympathy that probably worked on people who hadn't seen the photos of her screwing their husband. She sat in the same chair David had occupied, crossed her legs with practiced elegance, and delivered the speech she'd undoubtedly rehearsed. How sorry she was about my condition. How hard everyone at Meridian had been working to keep things running smoothly. How David had been such a steadying influence during this difficult time. How the board was optimistic about my eventual return, though of course there would need to be assessments to ensure I was fully recovered before resuming executive duties. Assessments. Like I was a damaged machine that might malfunction if given too much responsibility. Elena's performance was flawless. The concerned subordinate. The loyal assistant who'd stepped up in a crisis. The professional who recognized that my health had to come before my ambitions. She almost had me convinced she cared if I hadn't known she was planning to marry my husband in 3 days. Because that was the final piece Rebecca had uncovered. The wedding announcement buried in the society pages of the local newspaper. David Chun and Elena Rodriguez, scheduled to be married at the Grand Meridian Hotel on Saturday afternoon. A celebration of love that had blossomed during difficult times, surrounded by family and friends who'd supported them through recent challenges. Recent challenges. That's what they were calling the destruction of my life. Elena finished her visit with a gentle squeeze of my hand and a promise that everything would work out for the best. That sometimes life took us in unexpected directions, but that didn't mean they were wrong directions. That I should focus on healing and let other people handle the complicated business of running a company. After she left, I sat in the gathering dusk and felt the last traces of who I used to be burn away. The Sarah Chun who'd believed in loyalty and trust and the basic goodness of people she loved was finally, completely dead. What remained was something else. Something that understood power was the only protection against betrayal. Something that knew mercy was just another word for weakness. Something that was going to show David and Elena exactly what happened when you tried to bury someone who refused to stay dead. Rebecca picked me up from the hospital on Friday morning. The discharge papers were signed, my medication schedule established, my follow-up appointments confirmed. To the outside world, I was a lucky woman who'd survived a life-threatening medical crisis and was ready to begin the long journey back to normal life. But normal was relative. We drove straight to Rebecca's office, where she'd assembled a team of lawyers, forensic accountants, and investigators who'd been working around the clock to build our case. The evidence was damning. Financial irregularities, breach of fiduciary duty, conspiracy to defraud. corporate espionage, civil theft, criminal fraud. David and Elena had been sloppy in their confidence. They'd documented their plans in emails. They'd moved money through accounts that left clear paper trails. They'd made promises to potential buyers before they actually controlled the company they were trying to sell. They'd handed us everything we needed to destroy them legally, financially, and professionally. But Rebecca had saved the best news for last. The trust provision my grandmother had built into Meridian's founding documents could be triggered by a simple majority vote of the original board members. Since David had been so focused on manipulating the expanded board he'd created, he'd forgotten about the core group of 5 people who'd believed in me from the beginning. 3 of them had been horrified to learn what David had done in their names. They'd signed affidavits supporting the trust activation and my immediate restoration as CEO. Combined with the evidence of financial malfeasance, we had everything we needed to not just take back control of Meridian, but to do it in a way that would completely humiliate the people who'd tried to steal it. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. We'd wait until David and Elena were at their most vulnerable, surrounded by witnesses, committed to a course of action they couldn't back down from. And then we'd strike with overwhelming force. Their wedding was the perfect opportunity. Rebecca handed me a folder containing the legal documents that would restore my control of Meridian Technologies. Temporary restraining orders against David and Elena. Seizure orders for company assets they'd improperly transferred. Criminal referrals for the prosecutor's office. Civil suits seeking damages for their fraud and breach of fiduciary duty. Everything we needed to end their coup in a single devastating blow. I spent Friday night in a hotel room, preparing for the performance of my lifetime. Hair and makeup to hide the lingering effects of brain surgery. A business suit that projected authority and control. The kind of armor successful women wear when they're about to go to war. Saturday morning, I stood in front of the mirror and barely recognized the woman staring back. 6 weeks of fighting for my life had burned away everything soft about me. What remained was sharp edges and focused determination. Someone who'd learned that survival required absolute ruthlessness. The Grand Meridian Hotel was buzzing with activity when Rebecca and I arrived. Wedding guests milling around in their expensive clothes, completely unaware they were about to witness something that would make headlines in the business pages for months. David's family. Elena's family. Meridian employees who'd been invited to celebrate their new leadership. 300 people who thought they were attending a joyous celebration. They had no idea they were about to watch a public execution. I waited in Rebecca's rental car, watching the guests arrive, recognizing faces of people I'd worked with for years. Board members who'd voted me out while I was unconscious. Employees who'd accepted David and Elena's version of events without question. Investment partners who'd been told I was permanently incapacitated and unable to fulfill my duties. Every single person walking into that hotel had written me off, accepted my professional death as easily as they would have accepted my actual funeral. That was about to change. The ceremony was scheduled for 4 o'clock. At 3:45, Rebecca got the call confirming that all our legal documents had been filed and were now part of the public record. The restraining orders were active. The asset seizures were in effect. David Chun was no longer CEO of Meridian Technologies, and Elena Rodriguez was no longer Chief Operating Officer. They just didn't know it yet. At 3:50, I walked through the front door of the Grand Meridian Hotel. The reaction was immediate and electric. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Champagne glasses froze halfway to lips. 300 people turned to stare at the woman who was supposed to be too damaged to leave her hospital bed, standing in the lobby wearing a power suit and the kind of cold smile that promised someone was about to have a very bad day. I moved through the crowd like a ghost returning from the dead, which, in a way, I was. People stepped aside instinctively, recognizing something dangerous in my presence even if they couldn't name what it was. Whispers followed in my wake, but I didn't acknowledge them. My focus was on the ballroom where David and Elena were about to promise each other forever. The doors to the ceremony were closed, the wedding already in progress. I could hear the officiant's voice through the heavy wood, talking about love and commitment and the sacred bonds of marriage. about how David and Elena had found each other during difficult times and had chosen to build a life together despite the challenges they'd faced. I pushed open the doors. The champagne glass slipped from my trembling fingers and shattered against the marble floor. David stood at the altar in his perfectly tailored tuxedo, his face cycling through confusion, shock, and fear as he processed my presence. Elena was radiant in my grandmother's wedding dress, the antique lace and pearl buttons I'd been saving for a renewal ceremony I'd apparently been too naive to deserve. Her bouquet of white roses trembled in her hands as she realized her carefully planned future was about to implode. 300 guests turned in their seats, murmuring and pointing. The officiant stopped mid-sentence, unsure how to handle the disruption. Someone's phone was probably already recording what was about to become a viral video. I walked down the aisle with measured steps, my heels clicking against the marble floor. The sound echoed in the sudden silence, like a countdown timer reaching 0. David found his voice first, though it shook with barely controlled panic. "Sarah, what are you doing here? You should be in the hospital. You're not well enough to." "I'm well enough," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the ballroom. "Well enough to know that you divorced me while I was unconscious. Well enough to know you stole my company while I was fighting for my life. Well enough to know you've been planning this with my assistant for almost a year." Elena's face had gone white beneath her makeup. She tried to speak, to offer some explanation that might salvage the situation, but I wasn't finished. "I'm also well enough," I continued, reaching into my purse and pulling out the legal documents Rebecca had prepared, "to serve you both with restraining orders, asset seizure notices, and criminal referrals for conspiracy, fraud, and theft." The papers landed on the white carpet at their feet like bombs with legal detonators. David bent to pick up one of the documents, his hands shaking as he scanned the contents. I watched his face as he realized what he was reading. Watched him understand that every move he'd made had been documented, every crime he'd committed had been cataloged, every asset he'd stolen was being reclaimed. "This isn't possible," he whispered. "Rebecca Hartman doesn't exist." I checked. Rebecca Hartman represents the trust that owns 49% of Meridian Technologies, I explained, my voice growing stronger with each word. "The trust my grandmother established to protect me from exactly this kind of betrayal. The trust that gives me the authority to remove anyone from company leadership who acts against shareholder interests." I turned to address the crowd, knowing that witnesses would make this moment even more devastating. David Chen is no longer CEO of Meridian Technologies. Elena Rodriguez is no longer Chief Operating Officer. As of 1 hour ago, both of their access to company systems has been revoked, their corporate credit cards have been canceled, and their employment has been terminated for cause. The murmur that ran through the crowd was like electricity. People were pulling out phones, texting, and calling to spread the news. In minutes, everyone in our industry would know that David and Elena's coup had failed spectacularly. Elena finally found her voice, though it came out as a desperate whisper. "Sarah, please. You don't understand. We were trying to help. The doctors said you might never recover fully. We had to make decisions to protect the company." "Protect the company," I repeated, my laugh sharp enough to cut glass. "Is that what you call the meetings with potential buyers? The plans to sell Meridian at 30 cents on the dollar? The money you diverted to offshore accounts?" Elena's bouquet hit the floor as her hands flew to her mouth. David had gone gray, probably calculating exactly how much evidence we had and how many years in prison he was facing. "You want to know what's really funny?" I asked, stepping closer to them. Close enough that my voice would carry to every corner of the ballroom. Close enough that the cameras would catch every detail of their faces as their world collapsed. I actually died on that operating table. For 3 minutes, my heart stopped.
No pulse.
No brain activity.
Clinically dead.
And in those 3 minutes, while you two were probably celebrating your brilliant plan, I saw something that changed everything. The room was completely silent now. Even the hotel staff had stopped moving to listen. I saw what my life looked like from the outside. How I'd spent 12 years building something meaningful while the people closest to me were planning to tear it down. How I trusted and mentored and loved people who saw me as nothing more than an obstacle to their own ambitions. I looked directly at David, the man I'd pledged my life to, the man who'd promised to love me in sickness and in health. When I came back from the dead, I realized I'd been living my life all wrong. I'd been soft,
Trusting.
naive enough to think that loyalty and love actually meant something. But you taught me better. You taught me that the only thing that matters is power, and the only way to keep power is to be willing to use it absolutely. I turned to Elena, my former protégé, the woman I'd treated like family. Thank you for that lesson. It's going to serve me well in the years ahead. Rebecca stepped into the ballroom, flanked by 2 security guards and a process server. She'd been waiting for my signal, and now she moved with the precision of someone who'd orchestrated hostile takeovers before. Mr. Chun, Ms. Rodriguez, you're being served with restraining orders that prohibit you from entering any Meridian Technologies property or contacting any company employees. You have 24 hours to return all company property in your possession, including devices, documents, and access cards. The process server handed David and Elena their papers while the security guards positioned themselves nearby, just in case either of them decided to do something stupid. Additionally, Rebecca continued, her voice carrying the kind of authority that comes from absolute legal certainty, federal investigators will be contacting you both regarding evidence of wire fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy. I'd recommend you obtain legal representation immediately. David finally seemed to grasp the magnitude of what was happening. His face flushed red as anger replaced fear. You can't do this. I'm your husband. We built this company together. Ex-husband. I corrected. You divorced me, remember? While I was unconscious. And we didn't build anything together. I built Meridian while you sat in middle management at other people's companies, dreaming about being important enough to matter. The words hit him like physical blows. David had always been sensitive about his career, about the way my success had overshadowed his more modest achievements. Using his insecurity against him was cruel, but cruelty was a language he'd taught me to speak fluently. And Elena, I continued, turning to face my former assistant. I hope my grandmother's dress was worth it, because it's the most expensive thing you'll ever wear. By the time our civil suit is finished, you won't be able to afford a dress from a thrift store. Elena's composure finally cracked. Tears streamed down her face, ruining her carefully applied makeup and making her look like a gothic bride from a nightmare. I'm sorry, she sobbed. I never meant for it to go this far. It just happened, and then we couldn't stop it, and David said you were never going to recover anyway, and… Stop, my voice cut through her excuses like a blade. Don't insult my intelligence by pretending this was an accident. You planned this for months. You seduced my husband, stole my company, and tried to sell my life's work for profit. The only thing you're sorry about is getting caught. I looked around the ballroom one final time, taking in the faces of 300 people who'd witnessed the complete destruction of 2 lives. Some looked shocked. Some looked horrified. A few looked grimly satisfied, probably people who'd suspected what David and Elena were doing but hadn't been able to prove it. All of them would remember this moment for the rest of their lives. To everyone else here, I said, my voice carrying to every corner of the room, I want you to understand something. I didn't come back from the dead to seek revenge. I came back to reclaim what was always mine. Meridian Technologies will continue to thrive under leadership that actually cares about the company's mission instead of personal profit. I paused, letting that sink in. But if anyone else thinks my illness made me weak, or that surviving brain surgery somehow diminished my ability to protect what I've built, I hope today's demonstration has corrected that misunderstanding. Rebecca touched my elbow gently, reminding me that we'd accomplished what we came to do. The legal documents were served. The public humiliation was complete. David and Elena were finished, both professionally and personally. It was time to leave them to contemplate the wreckage of their own making. But as I turned to go, Elena called out one last desperate attempt to salvage something from the disaster of her choices.
Wait.
The company needs stability. The board won't accept this disruption. The investors will pull out. You can't just walk away from months of transition planning. I stopped at the ballroom doors and looked back at her. Still beautiful despite the tears and ruined makeup. Still manipulative despite having lost everything she'd schemed to gain. "Elena," I said, my voice gentle now, almost pitying. "Did you really think I'd spent 6 weeks in the hospital doing nothing but physical therapy?" Her expression shifted from desperate hope to growing dread as she realized there was more. "The board has already voted to reinstate me as CEO. The investors have been briefed on the evidence of your fraud and David's breach of fiduciary duty. The transition planning you're so worried about included selling Meridian's core technology to our biggest competitor for a fraction of its value." I smiled, and I knew it wasn't a pleasant expression. Everyone with actual authority already knows you were thieves trying to steal what didn't belong to you. The only people who still believed your story were the ones invited to this wedding. Elena sank into one of the white folding chairs, the weight of complete defeat finally settling on her shoulders. David was still standing at the altar, clutching the legal papers that had just destroyed his life, looking like a man who'd watched his own funeral. They made a perfect pair. Two people who'd thought they were clever enough to steal an empire and too confident to cover their tracks properly. Two people who'd learned too late that betraying someone doesn't make you stronger. It just makes you enemies with someone who has nothing left to lose. I walked out of the Grand Meridian Hotel into the late afternoon sunshine, leaving behind 300 wedding guests and 2 lives I'd just systematically destroyed. Rebecca fell into step beside me, checking messages on her phone as we headed for the car. "The story's already hitting social media," she reported. "Someone live-streamed the whole thing. It's going viral." "Good," I said. "Let everyone see what happens when you try to bury someone who refuses to stay dead." We drove back to Rebecca's office in comfortable silence. There would be more work to do in the coming days. Damage control with investors who'd been rattled by the leadership chaos. Rebuilding trust with employees who'd been caught in the middle of a corporate war. Criminal proceedings that would probably drag on for months. But the hard part was over. The betrayal was exposed. The conspiracy was broken. Meridian Technologies was mine again, and everyone who worked there would understand that their CEO had survived worse things than hostile takeovers and company politics. That evening, I stood in my empty house, looking at the spaces where David's belongings used to be. He'd taken everything when he moved out, probably while I was still in the coma. Photos of our wedding. Books we'd read together. The coffee mug I'd bought him for his birthday with a joke about his terrible morning attitude. 12 years of marriage reduced to blank spaces on shelves and walls. But I wasn't mourning what I'd lost anymore. I was calculating what I'd gained. Clarity about who could be trusted and who couldn't. Understanding that my own strength was the only protection I could count on. Knowledge that mercy was a luxury I'd never be able to afford again. My phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. I almost deleted it without reading, assuming it was another reporter trying to get a quote about the wedding incident. But something made me open it instead. It was from Elena. "I know you'll never forgive me, but I need you to know that I never meant for it to go this far. I genuinely cared about you, even at the end. What we did was wrong, and I'm sorry doesn't begin to cover it. But please don't destroy David completely. He's weak, but he's not evil. He just got caught up in something bigger than he could handle." I stared at the message for a long time, feeling absolutely nothing.
No anger. No pity. No satisfaction.
Just the cold recognition that Elena still didn't understand what she'd done wrong. She thought this was about punishment, about revenge, about me being vindictive toward people who'd hurt my feelings. She didn't understand that this was about survival, about establishing the kind of reputation that would prevent anyone from ever thinking they could exploit my trust again. About becoming someone who inspired fear instead of the kind of sympathy that made people think they could take advantage of me. I deleted the message without responding. Elena Rodriguez and David Chun were no longer my problem. They were cautionary tales other people would tell about what happened when you betrayed someone who had the resources and determination to fight back. 6 months later, I was standing in the boardroom of Meridian Technologies, looking out at a company that had not only survived the attempted coup, but had grown stronger because of it. Revenue was up 30%. Employee satisfaction had improved dramatically once the toxic leadership was removed. We'd landed 3 major contracts that David and Elena had been sabotaging in their efforts to make the company appear less valuable to potential buyers. The criminal trial had ended 2 weeks ago. David got 4 years for fraud and breach of fiduciary duty. Elena got 3 years and agreed to pay restitution that would bankrupt her for the next decade. Both of them were banned from holding executive positions at any publicly traded company for the rest of their lives. Their wedding video had become a cautionary tale in business schools, a perfect example of how corporate betrayal could backfire spectacularly when the victim refused to accept defeat. But I wasn't thinking about them anymore. My focus was on the future, on the new products we were developing, on the partnerships we were building, on the legacy I wanted to leave behind. I'd learned that survival wasn't about being nice or trusting or hoping for the best. Survival was about being smart enough to see betrayal coming and strong enough to crush it completely when it arrived. The Sarah Chun who'd gone into surgery believing in loyalty and love was dead. The woman who'd taken her place understood that power was the only true security and that mercy was just another word for weakness. I died on an operating table and come back to life as someone who would never be vulnerable again. Someone who'd learned that the most dangerous enemies are the ones who smile while they sharpen their knives. And if anyone else ever decided to test whether I'd forgotten that lesson, they discovered that some people are more dangerous after they've been betrayed than they ever were when they trusted completely. The building held its breath around me as I stood there, master of everything I'd nearly lost. But I wasn't the same person who'd built this empire with hope and hard work. I was someone harder, someone colder, someone who understood that in the end, the only person you can truly count on is yourself. And maybe, in a world full of David Chens and Elena Rodriguez's, that was exactly who I needed to be.